Sorry about that, babe.
After plotting around with various revisits to the first Breath of Fire, namely for channel coverage and of the improvement hack variety, we finally got around to Breath of Fire 2 on the SNES right here live streaming on my YouTube channel. There's been plenty of talk about the awful translation, which I will get into a bit later, but for the purpose of my first playthrough I wanted to experience it the way it was intended here for audiences in North America, developed and published by Capcom and released on December 10th of 1995. The story. The story of Breath of Fire 2 is a vast improvement over the first entry in the series. Again, yes, the translation is much maligned. I guess losing that Squaresoft oversight may have taken a big toll here in part due to Capcom's translation hubris, but nevertheless it actually has a surprising bit of depth to it, as well as pushing some boundaries for its time. The game begins 500 years after the events of the first entry, with a flashback as the main protagonist Ryu is seen as a young boy, the son of a priest in the town of Gate. Ryu's sister goes missing and is told to set out on a quest to retrieve her. Shortly thereafter, Ryu finds his sister Yu is sleeping next to a slumbering dragon which protects the gates to infinity. Ryu then dozes off himself, and when awakened, everything has gone cuckoo. No one recognizes him, his family is gone, and he teams up with an orphaned dog boy named Bo, shortly thereafter seeking shelter in a cave, and we get a future lore dump, and honestly, the intro to Breath of Fire 2 is pretty sweet and a definite engaging beginning to this vast journey. But without spoiling too much, you then flash forward some years later where both Ryu and Bo are living in hometown, doing a bunch of odds and ends jobs for the Rangers Guild. Sadly for Bo, a wealthy man has lost an item of great importance, and Bo is now falsely accused of the thievery and forced to go into hiding. Ryu's job? Well, to find the thief and set Bo free. That's the gist of the intro and the beginning of the game. Again, the story itself is pretty intricate. There's lots of playable characters, all with their own arcs, oftentimes sad in nature, and there is a massive religious theme permeating throughout the game. And to be blunt, despite not wanting to spoil every bit, the caveman explanation of it all is religion bad. Which again, for the time, is pretty groundbreaking. They are pretty in your face about it, especially down the stretch of the game, and all in all, this series story improvement and implementation, it ain't bad. I liked it. Graphics. Graphically, Breath of Fire 2 is a treat to look at. The character, town, and dungeon designs are all on point. The area where it shines the brightest here are the battles. The battle animations, enemy sprites, including some truly gigantic and grotesque creatures like Breath of Fire also did so well. Then the magic spells, the flow, it really just all worked well together. Another minor thing, and these don't happen super frequently throughout, but stuff like the Harpy boss fight early in the game with their super sick entrance just really helps set the tone of the battle ahead. The day-night cycles are also back, and it helps give certain areas such a different feel depending on the time of day. My favorite usually being that of the sunrise or sunset look, just gorgeous. I have no complaints whatsoever about the graphics. They are a major positive upgrade over the first entry. And honestly, Breath of Fire 2 is one of the prettiest 16-bit RPGs that I could think of. Music and sound. All in all, I could say that the music and sound here is pretty good. The soundtrack itself features a ton of good tracks, such as that of the intro theme, the battle themes, the overworld themes, the cozy nature of most town themes, the slinky nature of Grab the Tail, Hitting the High Seas with Grandpa, and many of the tracks towards the end also slap. I mean, the list goes on and on. The sound effects also do quite well. I feel like they convey the attacks, spells, critical hits, and so forth correctly. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows here. Without getting into specific negatives, I'll save some of those for later I guess. Breath of Fire 2 in my opinion is a step down from that of Breath of Fire 1. I continuously bump the Breath of Fire 1 soundtrack more often than I'd probably like to admit, but for good reason. Breath of Fire 2? Quite frankly, I just don't see myself doing that. That said, the music and sound are certainly good, just my direct comparison to its predecessor leaves me with a little bit to be desired. Controls. Obviously with a turn-based random encounter style JRPG, the controls are pretty hard to mess up. So as you could expect, Breath of Fire 2 is more than fine in this aspect. Traversing the overworld, controlling the characters, the menuing and engaging in combat, it's all very responsive and timely. Even the menu system is a bit more fine-tuned in this entry, giving some more shortcuts and sorting options for your quality of life game flow. Yeah, sure, I misclicked a few times while in battle, but ultimately that's on me being a bit too hasty, and maybe controlling Rands rolling on the overworld could be a bit hard to get used to, but overall, there's really nothing to complain about. Gameplay and fun factor. Aside from the story, and the graphics, and the soundtrack, dang, this must be a pretty good game, huh? The game also possesses good gameplay and fun factor. On the whole, Breath of Fire 2 just has it. Something that you will be doing quite frequently in Breath of Fire 2 is battling, and thankfully it's pretty sweet. Overall, I feel that Breath of Fire 2 has much more engaging combat than its predecessor, which came down mostly to marble crit spamming and dragon transformations. I mean, don't get me wrong, you kinda get into a samey groove as you go, but Breath of Fire 2 makes you think a bit more about your next move, and even features some nifty battle formations which admittedly I didn't really take advantage of. Speaking of the dragon transformations, they are yet again present in this game, but they work a bit differently. Basically now Ryu has spells that he could do in battle, and the higher that your AP is, the more effective the dragon attack becomes. This is definitely a preference thing, but I preferred the dragon transformations in Breath of Fire 1 for both their grand scale and how they were carried out. I mean, I can't really hate on it too much here, aside from the fact that I do remember reading about how a few of the dragon spells, I guess, do the same thing but with a different coat of paint. To be honest, I didn't really keep that much track of it during my playthrough, but maybe in an effort to rebalance the somewhat overpowered dragon transformations in the first game, perhaps they overtweaked them a little bit here, but whatever. The dragon transformations also bring me to my next point. There is so much optional content in Breath of Fire 2, it's quite staggering, especially for a first-time playthrough. You can actually miss some dragon transformations or attacks, whatever you want to call them, as they are somewhat hidden on the overworld. I didn't find those until way later on in my playthrough. There's also missable spells, missable items and weapons, and even missable characters. If you want, you can watch my short on that if you haven't already. And one of the other cool parts of Breath of Fire 2 is a town building aspect regarding Township. Admittedly, I did no research prior to my playthrough, and I missed a ton of stuff related to Township. You could really beef it out with NPCs, and apparently even do stuff like cook meals eventually. I've also seen things like someone that you could bring to Township will build statues of your party. There's just a bunch of fun stuff. I also found this to be a bit funny considering we just played through Terra Enigma prior, and there was so much focus obviously on world and town building there, so it was almost like a smooth transition, although admittedly I didn't really flesh out both of them. One of the other main things that occurs in Township are the shaman transformations, and there are also some missable shamans. The gist of the shamans is you combine different elemental shamans with your party members. Those party members then obtain buffs and sometimes super sweet transformations that completely change their sprites and stats. The concept was pretty cool. Piggybacking on some more missable things are the choice scenarios. There's actually quite a few throughout Breath of Fire 2 which give the choice to make an action, and depending on said action, well, some things change. Early on, you have the ability to either push Cat out of the way of poison darts or eat them yourself. Later on, there's a scenario with a well that gives you some in-battle choices, and there's a couple more. I don't like spoiling these too much, well, I guess aside from the cat one, so just enjoy and let things unfold as they may. The point here is that Breath of Fire 2 could have insane replay value beyond just that of choosing which characters you want to use for the majority of the game, or the final dungeon. I mean, heck, there's even 3 different endings. If all of this stuff that I said isn't incentive enough for you to replay the game, then I don't know what is. Speaking of characters, there are 9 total playable characters, with 1 being optional for you to choose from. They vary in not only their sprites and names, but their abilities both in and out of battle. You'll have some like Cat who are offensively gifted, some like Nina who can be magic powerhouses, and those like Rand or Bo who are basically your paladin type characters. But out of battle is where they truly differ. Many characters offer up forms of world traversing like Rand's rolling, Jean's hopping and swimming, Nina's flying, Sten's grabbing, and back in the fold is hunting from Breath of Fire 1 where you can now track down your prey with Bo's bow, Cat's Sticks of Fury, which could also smash rocks. And speaking of hunting, also back in the fold is fishing. This time it is much more advanced than that of Breath of Fire 1 where you actually play a legit fishing minigame. Fishing early on could be great for gold farming, and later on in the game with rod and bait upgrades you could track down some special items including Ryu's best sword, and even some special merchants. I found myself doing a lot of fishing early on, and then not so much at all until the end of the game tracking down some of the just mentioned specialties. All in all though, pretty cool. Speaking of Breath of Fire 1, there were a few nods back to the first game aside from a couple areas, hunting, fishing, and so forth. There's actually a heartwarming cameo appearance by 2 old friends on an island. The same scenario that befalls you in Tunlin in Game 1 also occurs in Game 2 revolving around the Magic Hood and speaking and understanding their language. But something else that's minor but vastly improved in the first game are the houses in the towns. Breath of Fire 1 was littered with mostly samey houses in the towns that were completely empty at times. Basically, they were pointless and lifeless. Not so much in Breath of Fire 2. It certainly helped make town exploration much more enjoyable. Again, a simple change? Sure. But needed? Absolutely. I also wanted to shout out Breath of Fire 2's difficulty. I touched on it earlier with some battling overview, but Breath of Fire 2 is not a cakewalk. I don't particularly love when RPGs are mind-numbingly easy, and Breath of Fire 2 is certainly not that. There will be some areas where you want to pull your hair out for sure. There will also be some areas, especially early on, that if you traverse a wee bit too far, you'll pay for it. mentally noting to not go back that way until a little bit later. So what will help you along the way with the difficulty? Obviously grinding, level and gold gaining, and keeping up with your gear is very important for success in Breath of Fire 2. There will be some difficulty spikes. One of my favorites was actually the Algernon and Girls boss fight. It was truly challenging. Sure, it could have been made easier if I found a few things prior, but when I finally completed the battle the way that I did, it was very satisfying. Some more things that I enjoyed about Breath of Fire 2 were the variety in the dungeons. There were so many dungeons with so many gimmicks that helped keep things fresh. For example, there was a dungeon where you were underwater and timed, and I almost died down there. You have a dungeon where you go inside the Fat Queen of Tunlin and rid areas of enemies or viruses. Another dungeon, though samey-ish looking to others, featuring a vision mechanic. There's really just a lot to keep you on your toes. And just another positive dump, I really did enjoy the story ramp up in the endgame, including the finalish cutscenes and the ending itself. Well, the one that I got anyway. Critiques. I want to preface yet again, like I did in some of my other reviews, that everything in this category isn't downright negative, but I have some form of what I deem to be a valid criticism for them. Despite Breath of Fire 2 being a technically solid and very fun experience, I did have some issues, so let's voice them. While I did enjoy the variety in the dungeons and their gimmicks, there were a few that really overstayed their welcome and were, quite frankly, incredibly annoying. I'm looking at you, Witch Tower, grindy as heck, long, and featured an out-of-place jump out the tower oops spot. Yeah, I did that. Of Ryu, which in order to be a completionist there took way too long, and of course the much maligned final dungeon in that of Infinity, which was just, ugh. Despite the cool story scenes, loot and bosses, the dungeon itself was an absolute slogfest. Oh, you know what else also sucked? Most of the dungeon music in this game was completely terrible. Basically a loop track that made me want to ram my head into a wall. I actually made a meme short about it, it's just god awful. I'm not being overly dramatic either, this track was terrible. Compare that to the various dungeon music in Breath of Fire 1 and it sounds like Breath of Fire's 2 version of Mansion Basement from Resident Evil Director's Cut on the PS1. Yeah, those who know, I'm sure you know. Another point that sucked relating back to dungeons was the exit spell. For the majority of the game, I felt like the spell just didn't work, forcing you to manually backtrack out of the dungeons, thus forcing you to endure random encounters. And endure is the key word. I had read so much about the encounter rate in Breath of Fire 2 that I was prepared, but I guess I really wasn't. The encounter rate is terrible. Smokes in this game, aka Marble 3 for the Breath of Fire 1ers, they just basically don't work. They are almost pointless and a waste of Zenny, item space, or AP if you're talking about the spell. Certain spots become way worse with this encounter rate, being capped off with the final dungeon where the encounter rate has tough enemies spilling out your bun's hole. Just ugh. The encounter rate in Breath of Fire 1 was also bad, but at least you could easily counteract it if you didn't want the experience in Zenny. My next point could also be tied into dungeon exploration and has to do with certain characters' abilities. There will be many times where you go somewhere and you can't progress without a certain character's ability. The main one that pops out to me, but trust me there are many more, is High Fort needing Sten to vault across the gaps. If this was Breath of Fire 1 it would be easy, you just go into your menu and put Sten in your party and off you go. But for some reason Breath of Fire 2 decided that you could only swap your party members at Dragon Save statues and at the house and township. I don't know why. Was this a memory issue, or was this an artificial padding of the game? Which is another thing that grinded my gears, as there were many spots of clear padding such as fetch quests, prolonged backtracking, and my favorite, finding Patty at the end of the game, which is basically like playing Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego for no reason. I mean, I get it. Lots of RPGs have fetch quests and some padding, but it was a bit more prevalent to me in Breath of Fire 2. I felt like the game could have been easily trimmed down a bit. Oh yeah, back to the character swapping and going back to the shaman transformations, you can only do this in Township as well, wouldn't really be an issue. But if you end up dying while transformed, or heck even getting into critical health territory, you lose your transformation and have to go back and redo it. Even worse off, after some big cutscenes you also lose your transformations. The worst offender of this was the midway point of the final dungeon. There's multiple ways to lose your shaman transformations in that area, and what's the way around it? Nothing really built into the game other than exiting, re-shamaning, and slogging through again. But for me, I did a planned death warp to avoid some nonsense, which clearly was not the developer's intentions, just ugh. The character swapping and shaman transformations as a whole, they had good intentions, but they really were not executed well. More on with the character swapping are the tons of instances where you have to use individual characters in order to advance the story. So yeah, if you chose not to level someone, you're probably screwed or you have to do some massive grinding in order to progress. The biggest one, and I'll spoil it because I'm sure some people got stuck here since it's relatively early-ish into the game, Sten at High Fort. If Sten is not at a high level or properly geared going into High Fort, you more or less are screwed. Trust me, I am all for the individual character arcs, the stories were cool, some of the fights were cool, but with no EXP share type system in the game, if the characters aren't leveled or geared, well, I got bad news for you. And yes, Sten is not the only one that had this type of scenario play out. And though I did enjoy the story as a whole and I found it to be very compelling, I do think the game struggled a bit around the second third, if you will. I was very intrigued during the first third and the final thirds, but I felt like the game took a slight nosedive during the 33 to 66% mark. During that time, the game featured some of those annoying solo character spots, some samey dungeons, and bouts of open-endedness that were just frustrating to me. Again, this is definitely more of a preference thing. I'm sure some people enjoyed this part of the game, but for me it was just kinda eh. Alright, lastly, let's get into the translation real quick. Yes, it's not that great. In fact, at times it is just bad. Random capitalization, weird spacing and punctuation, matter-of-fact speech, classic Breath of Fire shortening of items, weapons, and armors, item descriptions like "be used for fishing," "it is clothes," tons of weird grrring sounds, repeated dialogue chains, misgendering characters out of nowhere, and even some outright incorrect information likely just based off the translation. It wasn't that good. But I will defend it a little bit. This is me being positive in this section. I was expecting to get something that was entirely unplayable or unreadable, and the final product was not that. I had many moments where I was legitimately laughing out loud, feeling the emotion of the moment, and most of the time I knew where to go with what was said. I do think the translation has achieved some overly negative hype status. I mean, let's be real though. There's lots of bungles in many translations of this era. That being said, next time I do play Breath of Fire 2, I will use a translation patch and try to compare it as best as I can to see the differences in quality. In summation. Alright. Now I just got done verbally berating Breath of Fire 2 after putting it on a pedestal for much of the review. So where do my thoughts stand? Well, I'll keep it simple. Breath of Fire 2 is a great advancement from the first entry. Breath of Fire 1 is one of my favorite RPGs of all time. I find comfort in it, it's charming, it's almost like an SNES version of Dragon Warrior for me. But I can't sit here and say that Breath of Fire 2 isn't advanced across the board, sans the soundtrack, because it is. The game has a very interesting story, at times funny and engaging dialogue, wonderful graphics, a solid soundtrack, logical controls, tons of optional content, multiple endings, and a good difficulty. Marred by a bit of an insane encounter rate and grind, at times shoddy translation, a lack of quality of life features regarding swapping characters, abilities, and spells, and some mid-game-ish odd pacing choices. But with all that being considered, Breath of Fire 2 is rightfully deserved of a JRPG Banger Award. As such, I give Breath of Fire 2 on the SNES a 8.5 out of 10. Had some pretty minor improvements been made, I think this could have been much higher for me, but all in all, a great time is to be had. I highly recommend playing it if you haven't already, and if you already have, maybe go make some different choices this time. If you've enjoyed this review, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing if you haven't already. If you want to check out my first ever playthrough of Breath of Fire 2, check out the pinned comment description below or the end screen, and I'll also make sure to feature my Breath of Fire 2 mega playlist, where you can check out my shorts, my unboxing, the playthrough, and this review. Take care.